Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm joined today by Kyla, also known as Not So Erudite Online. So, Kyla, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Kyla. I am a content creator, pretty small time. I have a small channel that I have not been doing nearly enough content on in the last 6 months. It's called Not So Erudite. Sorry, editors. And I mostly explore on my channel kind of where the political meets the social. So I'm really interested in politics, but I am also really interested in more of kind of like a psychological or philosophical approach to thinking about socio-political issues. Right. So when you're talking about like a topic like women's rights, it's both a practical policy question, but there's also a philosophical question there as well, as far as like how do you navigate gender dynamics and like what's most fair and like how are we deciding what is fair and moral systems and which moral systems operate best in society. So I'm really interested in kind of exploring that. I would say like the focus theme of my channel is I don't really care what you think. I just want you to think well about it. Because I think there's lots of reasonable positions to hold in this world because of our lack of data. But there's also lots of really unreasonable positions to hold, and unreasonable ones drive me crazy. So I'm very interested in like checking my biases, thinking about fallacies, thinking about whether I have evidence up into a certain point, and if my conclusion that maybe has a gap of evidence is a reasonable conclusion with all the preceding evidence and stuff like that. So yeah.
That makes sense. And I really like that. I definitely appreciate, there's a lot of different things to delve into, but I appreciate the association between like policy and philosophy because I think about that a lot. As someone who works in public policy and who's coming from that sort of angle, it's fascinating because if I could, for example, go back and redo my undergrad, I got my undergrad in political science, and it's like I kind of wish I would have done a philosophy degree. But I feel like I've made well enough just reading on my own and all that. But no, I think that's really interesting.
Well, if you go to philosophy degree, you'd have way less people skills. It's like inherent to it. I think philosophy, they're like, okay, now you cannot talk to people normally. Go have fun in the world.
Yeah. So what led you to starting your channel? What did you do before that? And then what was your impetus for beginning to create political content online?
So husband's idea. I was running a program for the governor of Alberta called Mental Help. I had submitted an application with my previous workplace, where as an addiction counselor, basically taking my undergrad thesis. So my undergrad is like really weird and intense because we only do undergrad at the school I was at. So my undergrad honors project is the equivalent of about almost a master's thesis. So I wrote my own ethics application. I designed my own study with my supervisor, wrote the entire paper myself and started it, published my own poster and stuff like that, ran 2 studies. So the second part, the study 2 of my thesis was basically a self-contained prevention program that was like a continuation of you won't know these words, but Descartes' work and stuff like that about implicit theory. So how we think about ourselves. And then I was like, why don't I do this with mental health over COVID? Submitted it to the government of Alberta and they said yes. And so I built 13 programs. So 20-minute videos with a workbook that's attached.
Interesting.
And that's self-contained prevention. So I did depression. I did talks on prevention, anxiety. So the idea is to prevent symptoms of depression with the depression workbook, essentially. Yeah.
So you did work for the governor of Alberta. So how did you make that connection? How did I'm super interested in, I guess asking or learning a little bit more about that because that sounds like a really substantial contribution.
Yeah. Well, if my workplace had decided, so I was working for a company called Adira.
Okay.
And Adira was the one that submitted the application. And I was the contractor who kind of wrote the idea and they contracted to fulfill the application.
Okay.
So it was Adira that was technically contracted by the government of Alberta, and I was contracted as the program lead and developer.
Okay, and what's Adira? Is that
it's an addictions treatment center I used to work at?
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So the governor was contracting with them as an organization, then they contracted you to basically conduct the study and do a lot of the legwork that would then end up being implemented into this program.
Right. So the study was just done for my undergrad. That was separate and it was successful.
Okay.
So I just took the findings from my study and a whole bunch of people had done the same type of prevention program for other things and told the government of Alberta we could do this 13 times and it's self-contained. and it agreed to just disseminate it to people for free. And so we took the model of my thesis and then replicated it on 13 other topics.
Gotcha. All right, fascinating. So then what made you, all right, so your husband had some influence, and then you making the leap into going into online politics.
Right. So my social media manager quit like right before launch of mental health. So I was like, fuck. But we only had a year for the contract to be fulfilled. And so I could only offer that the person who was coming on like 3 months of work, which I didn't think I could find somebody to do like that small stint in a quick time. So I was like, I guess I'll figure it out. So Adira already had a social media manager. So she helped me a ton. And I just started doing social media management and program development for mental health. And I made a bunch of TikToks, and I would test TikToks on my personal account to see how it worked. And then successful ones I would put on the work account.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you'd use like your own personal profile as like a testing ground, experiments, see what work, what wouldn't work, and then like use that to implement into the more official company.
Right.
stuff.
Yeah. And so the problem is that all the ones that did super well, I like swore in them, and I couldn't put that on the work one. So I kind of just went like soft viral a few times, like getting over like 500,000 views or whatever. So pretty big, but like not like billions, millions or billions or anything like that. And I started like fighting with people in comments, and I was just I've always been like a very disagreeable, opinionated woman. And Nick's like, you should stream on Twitch and like just fight with people there.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And then he was like, this guy named Destiny, he'll talk to anyone. And I was like, sure. I don't know what I talked to him about.
So Nick is really the blame for all of the subsequent. Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So he made me watch Destiny talking to a counselor. I thought the counselor was full of shit and gave like terrible takes on a whole bunch of psychology-based stuff. So I emailed Stephen being like, this guy sucks, and I have a whole bunch of opinions. And Stephen obviously likes fighting, so he was really excited to bring me on. And then I talked. And I was streaming at the time, so I just kind of like blew up as a result of his community.
Interesting.
Just kind of continued on as like a side hobby while I finished my contract. And then it was between going to grad school or continuing this on, and I started getting like more and more and more success and traction. And I basically was like, I could go to clinical psych grad school, but there's almost like no other time in my life that I'll have an opportunity to like do social media, and I'm really enjoying it. So I should probably just like keep following it and see where it goes.
Sure.
And so I'm here now, and I've like I accepted and deferred my clinical psych program for a year. I've had to drop it and be like, hey guys, like I'm just not coming back right now. Yeah, kind of focusing on the social media stuff. And so I guess we'll keep seeing where it takes me. I'd love to get back to school at some point, but I need a school that's okay with the craziness of this space.
Yeah.
So, which my other school was very nervous about, which is part of why I decided to step away from the program. Is they really didn't want, they had one of their people like stalked or something. So they just had really bad feelings about social media.
Oh, wow.
So when I like was talking with the supervisor, she's like, of course we'll have you. But I could tell that she was like, but like you'd have to drop the social. Like I could tell there would be pressure to drop the social media. And I was loving the social media. And I figured if I've gotten to a clinical psych program one, I could probably do it again, but I don't know when I'll ever have a chance to like experience the social media race ever again.
Yeah, no, I definitely. So like a couple of thoughts. First, in regarding like how your programs or how the programs regarded your involvement with social media. It's a really weird moment that we're in, I feel, because like when I've told other people that I work with professionally that like I do social media work, usually it's regarded as at best like a hobby that I'll do on the side and not as like a serious professional venture, right? And in my personal perspective, like I don't think that that's giving it the way it deserves, either positively or negatively. Like I think it's going to continue to be a really important force, especially in the political world going forward. And I feel like we're starting to get to the realization of that. Like I see a lot of emphasis, like my focus is more in Maryland. I see a lot of emphasis from people in Maryland on social media, from talking to different political stakeholders there. It seems like there's a growing interest in it, but there's still like a lot of people who want to get involved, but then like do not understand it whatsoever, right? But at the same time, you see a lot of mistreatment of people on social media and how that can sometimes spill over into personal life. And I guess like the example like you brought up where someone, I mean, that's awful to hear about, but it makes sense why a school would then like be a little bit hesitant when they're just like, they just don't probably know what to make of it, right?
Like they just want to do the research.
Exactly. So it's like it's a lot of uncharted waters. It makes it exciting, and that's a big reason why I like talking to people about this and working in the space. But I mean, like, yeah, no, it's sort of the Wild West in that
It is
sort of
Wild
respect.
West. Yeah,
Yeah,
it really is, because there's no crimes. Like, there's so many things that people do online that I'm like, if this was real life, you'd be doing a crime.
Yep.
Like, you're actually doing harassment right now, but it's not criminalized. So we feel like it's more okay when it's like, it's probably not okay. Like, it's still like distressing people and upsetting. So it's truly the Wild West in that way. It's very kind of avant-garde, which is fun.
I've been using that. I remember I think it might have been you mentioned that a while ago. It's like has entered my lexicon
Yeah.
as of late. But then so something else that you mentioned too that's interesting to me is so your foray into online politics was really just like a one-to-one, like your husband told you about Destiny, you talked to him, and then that kind of introduced you to the rest of it. So that's interesting because I feel like a lot of people, and this was that I'm not sure if that's a more typical or atypical experience. My experience was more so like I was introduced to sort of like the general breadtube crowd. I consumed some of that content very generally for a couple of years. Then I was introduced to some of the streamers. Early on, it was like Xander Hall, Vosh, that crowd. And then from them, I ended up getting more of a foray into, I was introduced to like Destiny later on. And that's when I got more associated with his community. You know, like him and probably the people around him are like some of the people who I'm more associated with nowadays, I feel. But it was it was a much longer journey to get there. So, and I don't know, I feel like, I guess it's just like interesting. What has your general experience been with the online political space? Like, what have been your highs? What have been your lows? Yeah.
What's been my experience? I mean, the political space, it's been very interesting coming from like a health field. Sure, that's female dominated specifically. It's very woman centric. Most of your bosses are women, most of your coworkers are women, to a space where you don't have true coworkers. They're kind of coworkers, kind of like competition in a way.
Yeah.
And it's very male centric, male dominated.
Yes.
Right. So it's very, very different. I will say, like, I don't feel like I had seen like kind of in your face sexism until coming into this space. Where like I'll experience like liberal sexism is like my greatest pet peeve now. I fucking hate it. I hate liberal sexism. I almost prefer the boomers who are just like, you're a girl, you can't do shit, versus being like,
what do you mean when you say liberal sexism? Can you define that?
The worst part about liberal sexism is you can't fucking like put your finger on it well, because the people who are doing it are usually like liberals who are like for women, but they just like think feminine things are more cringe a little bit.
Gotcha.
So there'll be like a downplaying of you, or they're like more inclined to dismiss. I've had like a few meetings where like with like different people where like Nick was around and he was like, look, people like that would never fucking talk to me like that. Or like people would be like, oh, don't worry about that, Kyla. It's politics, baby, which is like so dismissive. And first of all, they were fucking wrong. And second of all, even if that is politics, it's fucking horrible and it shouldn't exist. If it is politics, get it out. Oh, and it's just like so demeaning. So there's like these little subtle demeaning things, but you can never call it out, because if you say, hey, you're being kind of sexist, they're gonna be like, what do you mean? I'm like, it's pro-abortion. Oh, and you're just like, ah, but you like still think makeup is just like silly and kind of gross, and you think that like girly things are just like childish and nice, and you like don't respect anything that's viewed as like feminine within our culture.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by like liberal sexism. It's very weird to experience. It's definitely a space where I think is obviously less friendly to women, but it's just not really friendly to anyone. Like, you really have to have good mental health strategies, good distancing strategies, because everyone's like, just like have a thick skin. The reality is like the space is pretty ruthless. People are really, really nasty and like are trying to tear each other down. And it can be like really depressing and like kind of make you question everything, make you like hate yourself. So it's really important to kind of have all these strategies and be like really mindful. And another thing that it does that I never expected is it commodifies a lot of your friendships. So especially with other streamers, there's always this like weird dynamic of trust where it's like this, like Steven's like trust modules is like, have I told you personal things that you could make money off of and you opted not to and kept it private anyways? And it's like, that's not a type of strain any relationship typically goes through, except for I've heard like some people in like like raw business will experience that, like
Yeah.
jockeying for positions and stuff. So it's like this weird, I trust you and you're my friend, but also like your friendship financially benefits each other.
Yeah.
Right. Like between me and Steven, obviously, it's like very unilateral in that like his friendship to me benefits me almost exclusively more than I benefit him.
Sure.
But also if I like sold out secrets of his at different times, I could get a ton of money and drama and play like new friends. Or if somebody sold out like secrets of mine that I told them, they could potentially like get a lot of money and friends. So it like creates this weird commodification of relationship that is super hard to navigate. And I think that's the part that like really mind fucks somebody is like my friends I can't trust and everyone's tearing me down. And I don't know if there's any good people out there. Like I think the space can really mind fuck people, which is why when people are young and get into the space, I feel so concerned about them. Because I'm like 28 when I got into the space, so I had a pretty good foundation.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. God, there's so many points. So first,
Sorry, I
like,
grabbed.
no, you're fine. Like I had a broad
You can
question.
interrupt me, by the way.
Yeah.
Please do.
No, you're fine. I asked a broad question. You gave me a broad answer. Regarding the commodification of relationships, that reminds me of a point that Natalie brought up when I had my last interview with her, where or I can't remember if it was she or I brought like we talked about like this sort of same principle where it seems like no, I think I did bring this up, but similar observation. I've seen in the sort of online political space, generally two kinds of people. And I mean, like, you can have any kind of categorization of people, but like broadly speaking, two kinds of creators, where on one hand, you have people who I think do get involved because they're genuinely motivated because they have something really important that they feel they want to say, or they have some kind of altruistic mission that they feel genuinely compelled by, right? Like there's something that this is what Natalie said, like something that you're like thinking about all the time in the shower that you're like, gosh, like I really am just trying to figure out like how to be able to communicate this idea to other people. And I feel like really genuinely motivated by that. And that's what really propels people to get involved versus other people who see YouTubers and see it as like a very accessible form of fame and money and don't see a lot of the work that goes in behind the scenes or a lot of like the effort that goes in because like it's really hard logistically to actually make this into a career and actually like become famous. And then even online, it's like, what does internet fame really equate to compared to like what a lot of people probably conventionally think of as fame, right?
Right.
But unfortunately, it probably is the case that there's a lot more people who have those kinds of more selfish motivations who do social media work and people who are more motivated by like, trying to either just like say something because they want to say it or some kind of like a more altruistic means. And yeah, like it definitely like it fucks with your head. And then I could say a lot about like, gosh, the sexism, the liberal sexism that you address.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've experienced this kind of issue, but I feel like a lot of people, especially women, who do kind of like the online political streaming are almost incentivized to, or not almost, are incentivized to give into really masculine habits and try to present as a exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just it's hard as because like I don't know. I think it is a fact that, like you said, it is an area that's more male dominated. It's more, the men are typically like the people who are the most prominent and most successful. And I don't know. What are your thoughts about like why that ends up being the case?
I feel like there's very few good models for how to be feminine and like a woman and embody a bunch of masculine traits in a healthy way. Because I feel like this is my frustration. Like I hate third wave feminism. Third wave feminism is why for a while I was like, I'm not a feminist because I feel like so much of it is like the boss babe trope. But what it really does is teach girls like be toxically masculine, be kind of just a bitch, and like fuck politeness and like work your way to the top. And it's like that's not good. If we saw like men giving each other this advice, which sometimes they do, we rightfully call it toxic and unhealthy and terrible. So there's very few like modelings of especially like a woman who maintains high femininity, right? That's why like ContraPoints is really, really interesting because she's incredibly feminine.
Sure.
She embodies tons of feminine traits, but then the way that she socially engages, for example, and like rifles through ideas tends to map more onto like the way that we socialize masculine people to do so, right? A little bit more like linear, a little bit like cutting through the bullshit. But then she still pulls in like kind of these artistic, kind of feminine emotional parts. And it's tricky even describing these things. One of my like most classic things I've noticed is when I describe the feminine and the masculine, most people will agree to some degree what our society is capturing as a masculinity, whatever, which is it's societally determined mostly, right? But then when I try to say like this is what our society has decided seems to be femininity, I feel like people always fight me. But those are all the lame things. And I was like, I don't know why understanding somebody, being artistic and creative, and like using story and narrative to drive home a point is like cringe and not cool. It's just as cool. It's just not like in your face. It's not like Captain America shit. But like it's still valuable. And so I feel like there's very few people who model high masculine social dynamic of like direct and fast and assertive, but maintain high femininity. Because like Camellia Paleo was kind of filling that role in like the 60s, 70s. But I'd say like she's increased, like I wouldn't say she has high feminine, right? She's maybe in like business suits. She's got like the short cropped hair. She's just like fucking yelling at everyone and being like a turf all the time. And she's just like really aggressive and in your face. And you don't feel any of that like warmth or art or like understanding that we typically associate with the feminine with her. So I feel like for a lot of women getting into this space, we kind of have to like create the wheel. And it's really tough to do in a social media space where everyone's criticizing you.
Yeah.
You have very few friends. There's pressure from rad femmes to be a girl's girl, which has its own like toxic feminine traits to it. So you might be resistant to that. So it's very isolating because it's like you can't really talk to your male counterparts about this because they're not going to get, even if they empathize, sure, what can they tell you to do? They haven't begun to even be socialized. They don't experience the day-to-day experience of just walking around and being a feminine person.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very tricky for feminine people to kind of like break into the space, just as it's incredibly difficult for masculine people to break well into more feminine dominated spaces, right? So I think not so much like psych, because psych actually started masculine and then became filled with women later, but I think like daycare and like nursing. Like it's really difficult for I think a man to feel like a masculine man and be doing these types of roles. We haven't really created the archetype. Right. And so nobody can map on super well other than being like, oh, you're a nursing guy. So you're like probably like, you know, a little more gay. Like you're not gay, you know, but you're you know, and it's just like, but maybe he's not, you know. I know like lots of male nurses are like fucking jacked and like tattoos and beards and just right. And they're a nurse. And so they really have to like self-create that archetype kind of against resistance, which I think is what's happening for women into politics. It's tricky.
So I guess I'm curious if you think, because a big issue that I've seen in the online political space is that not only are a lot of the creators tend to skew men, either like masculine presenting or are men just in general. But also that means that, well, I'm not sure like it's hard to say like where the correlation and causation is. But then a lot of the viewers and the consumers in the space are themselves men. And so but this goes counter to my experience doing a lot of IRL political activism and advocacy, because like if you go canvassing or if you go work in a legislature, especially
volunteering is a feminine thing.
Yeah. And like a lot of people that you meet volunteering or a lot of the staffers over, for example, like the Maryland legislature tend to be overwhelmingly women. And so it seems to be like a really stark contrast. And I feel like it's not an impossible thing to be able to like try to bring more overlap, and that could be healthier for the space. But I haven't really figured out, or I don't have a lot of thoughts about how to do that. So I guess I'm curious if you have any thoughts, or if you think it's just like kind of I don't know, like, is it?
It's a question I wrestle with all the time. I definitely don't have a perfect answer.
Sure.
Right. Like when I think about the canvassing events that I help organize, it's coming from a streamer space. So it's just like all dudes.
Sure.
And the question is like, how do you get more women and femme people coming? And I don't know how to do that, because you're essentially saying, how do you socially engineer away this problem? And like social engineering is incredibly difficult, incredibly complex. And that's why like, you know, it's easier to fall back on tradition because we at least know like what kind works, right? When you're creating something new, when you're being progress, is why being left is in many ways really difficult, is you're making up new ideas when the traditions kind of got us by for the last like couple 10,000 years, you know?
Sure.
It's well enough. It's hard to push it forward. So I'm not sure. I don't know if even like simple, small things like making carpool groups that are intentionally built around like a type of common interest that will like help women just kind of find each other in a space so that they feel like they have another person. Or if there's pushing people to being more open to kind of a like emotional exploratory way of discussing politics that doesn't feel like just that isn't viewed as soft and weak and isn't soft and weak, because sometimes when you do like just the emotional appeal stuff, it is kind of like cringe and weak and silly. So like, how do you do that in a way that doesn't lose like strength of like logics and being reasonable and stuff like that? And I don't know, and I don't know the answer to this, because they're both really, really valuable. I think like what politics is most missing is that feminine like sense to it. I just don't know the perfect way to do it. But there's got to be a way. I'm gonna come up with it. I don't know what it is because I'm 30, so I'm still got a lot to learn. But I'm thinking about it. So if you ever discover the answer, let me know.
Yeah, for sure. Do you mind if I switch to talking about policy?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So we all talk about politics. Everyone has opinions on policy, or hopefully they do. So I'm curious if there's any areas of policy that you feel particularly passionate about.
If we're talking about like strict like legislative type policy, I can get really passionate about a lot of things. I have a lot of feelings on many things. I'm really
pick like one of the areas where you're like most passionate about.
Sure. I'm really, really passionate about like education.
Okay. Say more.
So I basically am like a radical public education reformist. I basically want to like burn it all down.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I really hate our school system and our foster care system. I just want to burn them both down and like start from the bottom up.
So wait, are you talking about like, because you're from Canada originally, so are you talking Canadian or US?
Your guys is way worse than ours, but yeah, both.
All right. Well, I'm not sure if I mean, I'm sorry, like I'm not here to get my own opinions on it. But like
that's my whole job.
Yeah, but well, so say more. So why do you have really strong negative opinions about the public education system?
I think public education, by and large, is babysitting for parents. What it does is it allows it allows the couple to enter the workforce and for them to fully abandon their household for up to 8 hours a day and their child to be occupied elsewhere, right? That's fundamentally the purpose that it serves. That's in large part reasons why major advocacy happened for it, was to free up parents. So in many ways, it is free childcare. The problem is that you have underpaid and undereducated individuals working with kids in some of the most critical developmental windows of brain's formation, teaching them oftentimes 30 to 40-year outdated information, and arranging them in groups of up to 30 when really like 10-year-olds, you should be maxing out at 8 to 1 for adults to get like proper kind of structuring socialization. And then because of like America's cringe liability, we can sue everyone for everything stuff, kids are like deeply staunched in what they can do in recess and in play. And I see it as basically like we learned from like the Soviet schools that governments are really bad at being parents. And the public education system is just like more of that, except like the teachers kind of get fucked. The only one who's really benefiting is fundamentally like the economy itself, because it's like not even business that's benefiting. So like I'd want to see like school reduced in hours. I don't think 8-year-olds need to be in school for 8 hours a day. They definitely don't have the attention span. They definitely don't like it. And most of the work that they do is filler. It's like Naruto filler episodes. We're like, why am I watching Naruto chase an ostrich for like 4 episodes straight? I don't know why we're doing this. Which a lot of parents learned through COVID, right? So in COVID, we had a ton of kids come home and parents be like, what the fuck is this? Like, what are they learning? Like, they would just be the I remember like doing homework at the addiction center because we had moms and their kids with like the kids. And I was always just like, I don't know. I don't know what this is teaching the kid. Like, I understand some things are like hard to grasp. I'm 90% sure this shit's just like filler. Because I don't, this is a Naruto ostrich chasing episode because I don't know why this is here. There's no shot that's worthwhile. And then this kid here is agonizing as they listen to their friends play, trying to like decide which type of like shape they want to draw to describe their family tree, right? And it's just like, no, this is important like at all. It typically starts way too early. One of the leading causes for men having bad handwriting because fine motor development of young boys develops slower than young girls. And so they start trying to learn fine motor skills when their brain isn't developed enough, and they cement patterns of writing from a underdeveloped fine motor system into their handwriting, which is why boys almost always have poor handwriting. And most kids who are going to have, you see this in some girls, right, as well. Most kids that have that really poor handwriting, it's often because their fine motor system wasn't ready to start learning things like printing and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Right. So we like rush kids along. We teach them things that I don't think matter, and we don't teach them things that I think would probably be more valuable. We have the fact that like preschool teachers have like the least amount of education, when there is no question that like 3 to 6 is like one of the most critical developmental windows of schema system building, which is like the foundations of how you understand the world and how it interacts. And these people are like very underpaid, excessively overworked, and vastly undereducated with way less tools than they need. And so it's like we're just like underserving kids and teachers and parents. It feels like in basically the most expensive way we could possibly do so. It drives me crazy because there has to be a better model than this.
I mean, I can get some of that. I'm not sure. Well, I mean, sorry, let me gather my thoughts a little bit. So I can agree with some of the criticisms that you raise. I think that there's a lot of merit, though, to be had for some of the ways that we currently conduct our K through 12 education system, especially in the public school sense. Even if there are some problems with it. I remember I had a conversation similar to this a couple of months ago. I think it was at the February PV event, actually. There was some discussion on public schooling there and the merits of it. To me, some of the biggest benefits of public schooling, regardless of the particular content that ends up being taught, and sure, we can always be able to talk about the content on the specific content to be taught. But I really like public K through 12 education because by virtue of the fact that it's public and it's run by the government, and you can be able to have some input on the content that's being taught, probably to small degrees, but some effect. Like you can have a greater effect than comparatively, like if you were sending your child to like a private education, like a private school, right? Then I like that because it means that we have at least a rough approximation of a public education where maybe it's not exactly what everyone in society wants it to be, but it can be like ideally, if everything is functioning as it should be, it can be a rough approximation of like what most people would want to see the most, right? And so I think that most people probably want their kids to be taught certain kinds of reading skills. Most parents want to see their kids taught some kind of math skills and some kind of science background. Like it's not necessarily the case that like, there probably could be, for example, like certain studies on, or we probably could find objectively better things to teach kids in public education. But I think that a larger consideration has to be that, like, well, you have to make sure that parents, at least the majority of parents, are comfortable sending their kids to public education, and that means that like enough people have to buy into what's being taught in the first place for them to feel comfortable. Otherwise they're just going to want to do private education. So that's the first thing. And then related to that, a really big benefit, and this is something I really appreciate, is that public school is one of the best places for kids to socialize and learn how to interact with other people in society, to develop a lot of those soft social skills. Maybe it's not like they're objectively taught those things in classes per se. But like if you put a bunch of kids in the room, like they're going to learn real quick that a lot of people aren't great in society, and they're going to learn how to be able to find friends and make connections and build relationships, maybe even with people who they don't like as much, or with people who they do. But there's so much that comes from that I feel like I wouldn't be comfortable like completely overhauling that. I understand what you're saying in respect to like, especially that we often put people who are probably often underqualified or who don't know what they're doing in those kind of positions. And there's a lot of different conversation about how to be able to address that. But I guess like the main question I have to you is like, and I try to ask this of all of my guests is like, what, and I guess I'm trying to figure out, because you're basically just like, you don't like a lot of it in general.
Well, to be clear, I still want public education.
I guess like
Universal education is very much what I want. I don't want to wholly reform the system.
So like, I guess that the question is like, how would you reform it? And also what benefits do you currently see to like how it's operating as it is?
Yeah, so I think the benefits are a lot of what you outlined. There's general populist buy-in, and like peer-to-peer interaction is essential, right?
Sure.
Those are like these are the two like main things that I fully agree. So I like, and in general, having a populace that's literate and capable of doing like mathematics and stuff to a certain level is highly, highly valuable, which is why I still want fully accessible. There's interesting pilot projects that have looked at like single payer healthcare and single payer education systems.
Okay.
So essentially, you privatize all of these things. However, the single payer that pays for it is still the government. So there's a private kind of capitalist competition that begins to occur amongst schools, right? So you get because one of the best things about capitalism is it turns one of the worst things in the world, which is profit motive and people being greedy, and you utilize it for some level of good, because you have to kind of do some level of good for people to like buy your stuff and want to continue to buy your stuff, right? You can't like give shit product and overcharge for the most part unless you have a monopoly.
I think that's generally true. We could talk about advertising and how that affects.
I agree.
Sure.
Right. I'm not saying we live in a current perfect capitalist system by any means, right? But seeing like schools having some ability to somewhat compete against each other for essentially educational contracts from the government. So taxpayers are still paying for it. It's just the oversight of it isn't going to be a random bureaucratic politician. It's most likely going to be probably like some sort of selected official for their skill in education itself. And there's greater levels of accountability, because if it's like a private institution competition, then there's certain things that you're going to need to promote, right? When we say that like parents know what their kids are being taught, we kind of know what our kids are being taught, but COVID really highlighted that parents don't really know what their kids are being taught. They know generally that they're learning like math and social studies. They know like the basics, but they don't really know how that's being taught. They don't really know what level of history kids are actually learning. They don't really know what science topics kids are learning. And I just see like single payer models seem to have some merit. That's really interesting. I'd also be super open to kind of looking at the single payer system and then some sort of like co-op system where teachers get to actually like within their own school weigh in and vote on policies and educational reform, because if anyone should really understand it, it should be ideally the people that you're hiring to do that. And I'd want to see teachers being paid way more, and the qualification expectations are much higher, right? So that we've got very well paid, very educated individuals in maybe some sort of co-op. Again, I don't know the exact logistics of how it would work because I'm not a policymaker necessarily. My question is, how do we make this better? Because I really do think it's antiquated and it needs to be reformed like now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely get that. I appreciate the specific, I appreciate the bidding suggestion. I guess that like the main thing that I would be interested to see like in terms of implementation, because a big problem that schools, insofar as I understand, always face is that everyone agrees that yes, it's more important to get like the best and most qualified people possible to be able to teach. It's just very difficult with the resources available and with how many schools are looking for those kinds of qualified individuals to be able to find people who are fit for the job. Right. And so it's like, yeah, I just don't know necessarily what's going to be the solution for that. There's lots of nonprofit organizations who will find volunteers. Like think about like the Teach for Americas, where you find, they have a really interesting model where they're able to get people who are very qualified, like think like recent college graduates, people going to master's program, et cetera, and so forth, who will do temporary teaching stints at underprivileged schools. I believe that there's some government programs that are focused on trying to send more qualified teachers to underprivileged schools. I believe that there's some of that. But yeah, I mean, like, I don't think there's any necessary disagreement on like the issue. It's just like always finding an answer with the resources that are available is usually the really hard part.
Exactly. And this really highlights the issue of social engineering, right? It's always easier to fall back on tradition because at least we know the public school system that we have right now kind of works. People are broadly literate. School does a good job of socializing. It gives parents a break, right? It kind of ish works for the most part. Yes, there are problems, but it's like, are these problems so big that it requires like a radical teardown? And basically my argument is yes, not because I hate the system so much we got to burn it down, but because I think the problem with the system is so intrinsic to how we built it that the only way to solve it is from like a whole system overhaul. But that would also probably look like, again, probably changing types of labor laws. Because if parents no longer are required to work 40 hours a week, but they work 32, all dependent school days can change. School can be 4 hours a day potentially, or more likely 8 hours, but 4 days a week, 3-day weekends, right? What would that look like? Would that change? Would that have an uptick for the kids? Would it have a downtick for the kids? I think it's Sweden, maybe? One of the Nordic countries, classic, currently has a 4-day work week implemented. And so I'd be super curious to look at studies, because all of this I want to be like, When I say radical, burn it down, I wouldn't be agitated. I don't want to like burn it down today with nothing tomorrow, right? I want like people to take it seriously, being like, we want to reform the system within the next 20 years.
Sure.
We're doing it. We're looking into the policy now. We're piloting it in a whole bunch of different areas to see what actually works, right? We know Head Start programs work really well for inner city school kids. We know that nurse care partnerships seem to work also really well for like specifically addiction treatment in inner city schools and high risk schools and stuff like that. So just like looking at policy, because there really is, I know it's really expensive. I think my biggest frustration is governments are really, really wasteful with money. They really throw money at shit that probably could be solved with more cost-effective solutions if the money wasn't guaranteed. And so, yeah, I'd be super curious to see what would happen if we like audited a public education system and we look and we're like, oh, all these middle tier managers don't need like half of them. It'd be way better if we got rid of them, increase the pay of teachers so that there's greater incentivization for upwardly mobile individuals to go into teaching because it's actually like a very, very profitable and high prestige job, right?
Sure. In regards to the idea, I mean, like, I think that the bigger problem, because in my opinion, like, you know, in full disclosure, like I previously worked for the city of Baltimore. Like I've worked in that kind of government job, and in that job, I specifically was overseeing like a substantial amount of government funds. At least from my perspective, I don't think that the problem is necessarily that there's a lot of misspending or misuse of public funds. I think that the larger issue that a lot of people probably feel is that how the government spends money and how the government's habits for spending money changes very slowly, and then how it's actually spent in the first place is often very slow. And part of that is by design because so for example, the funds I was working on in the office I worked on were COVID funds, right? And so because we received those funds from the federal government, we had to adhere to section, I have to remember the specific one, section 1337, which is an entire code of federal regulations that have all of the specific rules about how states and local governments can spend funds received by the federal government. Right. And there's a massive number of regulations that have been developed over a long period of time to, at a high level, basically ensure that there is no misuse of funds, there's no corruption in spending, that there's no bribery. Essentially that the funds are used in the ways that it was intended to be used in the first place.
Right.
And in order to follow those kinds of guidelines and practices, it takes a long, long fucking time to go through all of your contracts, to go through and basically talk to and collect evidence and essentially guarantee like, hey, you're following these hundreds of different regulations we're telling you to follow, right? And so like, and as a consequence, at the end of it, it means that if you want to change how the government spends money, it requires a lot of federal regulatory overhaul. Now, that's not to say that that's necessarily, I'm being critical of that structure because I think it does a good job at preventing what it's trying to prevent, which is misuse of, misuse of funding in the way it was intended to be used.
Right.
But for the kinds of changes what you're wanting to propose, that would basically mean like introducing like new regulations or new legislation, like fundamentally changing everything from the ground up. At least from what I'm hearing.
Yeah, which is why it's kind of like a pipe dream. I don't talk a ton about it publicly because I don't think it's reasonable to happen, especially without like an alternative system to turn to, right? And the ship is really slow to move. And so it's just a tragedy to me to know that like if I have kids, I'm going to probably try to pray for private school because I want my kids to get quality education. But it's a little gross to me that like I can buy into basically my kids getting good education, whereas my tax money is going to pay for kids to get like lower income kids to get kind of mid to like shit tier education, probably missed diagnoses, inattentive teachers, overworked teachers, teachers who were tenured for way too fucking long and should have been fired 30 years ago because they hate children, right? All sorts of these like issues of like a slow moving bureaucratic shit. And I think a big problem with all of our modern democracies is kind of this like bureaucratic bloat question. And the solution isn't obvious. I don't know what it is precisely. My question is, can we start thinking about it? Can there be alternatives? Can there be pilots? Because I believe in human ingenuity deeply. which means if we're having these problems, there has to be solutions to find them. We just need to put the right minds together to find them and give them the time. But let's be honest, one of the worst things government is paying for prevention type programs. They really like to pay for problem solving, but they don't want to pay for problem preventing. When we basically know that if you prevent problems, it's way cheaper, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that's actually a good pivot. So the last area I kind of wanted to cover, to talk about, and especially, from pivoting off of the idea of like, it's probably most important, to try and focus on getting the government to pay attention to different kind of solutions, whether it's proactive solutions or preventative solutions to prevent the issues from happening in the first place.
Right.
Most of that is going to happen from electing new legislators, from getting new ideas in the office. And so something I'm really interested in is some of your perspective about how we can maybe use social media to make some positive impact in that sort of respect. Like, so I know that you've had a lot of influence, whether it's your work with PV or your work with Destiny, about having some effect on mobilizing people previously. And that's something that you're going to continue doing. And so I guess I'm curious from your perspective, first, what is some of the work that you've already done that you think has had the most impact using social media to be able to mobilize people to have some kind of IRL political good impact? And then what are the things that you would recommend to other either followers or content creators to be able to have similar kinds of positive impacts in the world?
I mean, probably the most like large net effect that I've been involved in would be the Ohio canvassing that we did with Destiny's community.
Okay.
Right. You get 330 volunteers turning out to do a listening canvas, just basically say like, what do you want? And then forwarding the answers to that question to these local representatives who have the power to answer what they want. So I think that was like probably the biggest thing that I've been involved in as far as like social media directly impacting like boots on ground.
What do you think went into that? Like, how is that? So, like 300 people from Destiny's community. So, like, is that something that any content creator can be able to do, or is that something relatively unique to Destiny? Like, what's in your opinion, the alchemy for making that happen?
I do think streamers are unique in that way.
Okay.
I think they can mobilize their audience in a way like almost nobody can, because of the type of viewer and the type of dynamic that occurs between a streamer and viewer is like different than almost any other form of social media, right? Like TikTok is notorious for low conversion. You get lots of eyes on it, but it doesn't turn out to sales very often. Most like major TikTokers that I know complain how they like can have like 500,000 followers on TikTok and they can't break like 10K on YouTube, right? Because the transference is so low.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So part of what's unique about streamers is that the nature of that, like what's called like the quote unquote like parasocial relationship, which is often viewed in like a very negative way. Most research that's been on it is pretty neutral. It can be negative, can be positive. Usually it's just kind of neutral.
Yeah.
But essentially the viewers have this more bought in relationship with the streamer and with the community, right? So it becomes its own community as well. And so when Steven says you guys should come to Ohio, viewers go, well, A, I can meet Steven, but B, these 4 other people that I've been like talking to in chat for like the last 6 months, I can meet them finally and like hang out. So there's like friendship opportunity as well that I think is different, right? When you're in like a YouTube like video essayist, it's not like in the comments you see like the same 2 commenters going back and forth being like, how you doing, pal?
Yeah.
How's Wendy? And so it really does foster this like live community that I think is really mobilizable. I don't really see social media broadly being able to do what live streaming does. Social media is going to be a lot better at doing things like pushing narratives, media, propaganda, and like ideology, right? Like that's what social media broadly does. And then I think streamers uniquely can push mobilization.
Interesting. No, because I mean, I definitely and especially when we're talking about trying to focus on different kinds of content. I think that a lot of people look at, for example, TikTok and see that it's really easy nowadays to be able to like blow up from out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Like, just from what little I've been able to see, it's interesting because there's almost they almost have their own like ecosystem completely separate from like Twitch and YouTube politics of like their own political sphere of content creators. And on one hand, it makes it seem like really interesting as an opportunity because it's like, oh, a whole other wealth of people who could potentially want to get involved in canvassing efforts and all those sort of things. But yeah, I mean, like I would be curious to see if they're able to, for example, help to recruit for events, how many people that they'll be able to bring out, and if that's able to be measured. Because I do suspect is probably right, like what you said, that they're not going to be able to bring as many people out. Something I talked to Josiah when I interviewed him was that there was an article that I read regarding the TikTok ban, and actually it talked about how the people on the Hill who were, like the sponsors and the office working primarily on passing the legislation, were astounded that like actually very few people reached out to them, if anyone. Regardless, which is a completely different idea than you would get if you were watching everything happening on TikTok, where there would be like videos with like 100,000 plus likes, not views, likes, right? So it's going to be like crazy high number of views, like for videos talking about like, oh, the TikTok ban is happening. Reach out to your local congressman or woman, tell them to vote against it. And it's just like, it doesn't seem like that really translated to anything.
Yeah. And I mean, it's part of like who's the viewer, right? Like a TikTok viewer is pretty low committed to anything that they're watching.
Sure.
They probably pay attention. I think the average watch time for a TikTok viewer is like 5 seconds, whereas for a streamer, it's an hour and a half.
Okay.
And for a video essayist, you're doing really well if you've got like 5.5 minutes. That's really good. 17-minute mark if you're doing hour-long videos.
Sure.
Right. So you've got a different audience there, which is why I wouldn't be surprised to find out that people who do TikTok live, they probably can actually have a much better turnout because they've got that live component. They're probably getting chatters in there. They're interacting. They have that kind of more built relationship going on with the TikToker. They become invested in them as a person.
Sure.
Whereas a video creator, I suspect, could probably cultivate a culture of mobilization. It'll just take a lot more intentional work, a lot more inclusion into all of the videos, and probably a lot more community posting, and probably most importantly, directing people to like a Discord, right?
Sure.
So that there's, again, that community interaction piece that seems to really help with mobilization because by and large, you do what your friends want to do, or you do what gives you friends. This is how alt-right pipelines mostly work, is that lonely dudes would go with their bro friend to a Proud Boys meeting, and they instantly had a brotherhood that they had access to, right? So they didn't even care about the ideology. They're just fucking lonely. And then they come to believe in the ideology because it's just like what's around them, right? They're just like, they keep getting exposed to it. I think the same thing can happen anywhere. It's just where are your friends, and a lot of left-leaning people seem to like never touch grass or like make community group things, which is very odd.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's not a thing on the left, but
I don't know. But it is interesting though that like so in theory, right, if you were to have like any other content creator, let's say someone who's not like necessarily a streamer per se, but if they were to integrate, like let's say that they want to start mobilizing or consider mobilizing their community more, then maybe integrating streaming into a more mainstream part of their media strategy could be a really good part of that, because then they can start building more of those parasocial relationships with their audience. And then that would be like a good first step to like leading up to mobilizing them to go out to like canvas for various candidates or elections or what have you.
Yeah.
All right. Interesting.
Yeah. Have a Discord, spend some time in there.
Yeah.
I hang out in my Discord. I talk to people that are in my community.
Is this the plug to join? Do you have like a Discord, like a official?
I do, but we're really kind, but we're mean. So like, if you're annoying, we have a golden rule. You can't be dumb, mean, and wrong all at the same time often, or we'll take you out.
Dumb, mean, and rule.
Dumb, mean, and wrong. Okay, if you're all three of those things, you're unbearable. Okay, everyone knows a person who's dumb, mean, and wrong all the time, and they're so unpleasant, and they don't last long in our community.
I like that.
Yeah,
No,
so you're welcome, but we're kind of like debate bros and feisty, very diverse. We've got lots of diverse perspectives, very diverse population, but everyone there is very kind. They care about you, and they will tell you you're a dumb fuck. Inevitably.
Amazing. No, I that's actually, I really like that because no, something I was talking with Natalie previously about, and I talked a little bit with Josiah, is that like it seems just really hard if you then like try to create a Discord, especially one that's politically focused. It seems like it's really hard to have that, to build that kind of community without it end up like kind of
imploding.
Yes, exactly. So I don't know. Do you have any wisdom for keeping that from happening?
I think it is tricky because it's essentially a moderation question by and large. And like I can give the advice of what works for my community, but my community works for me and people like me, which means that it's not a perfect fit for somebody who's like, I don't like that. Like, that's super fair. That's just what we prefer. That's the way we socialize. And so we click over that, right? I mean, some things that I think are really important, if you ask to be a mod, you'll never be a mod. We never give power to people who really want power. It's usually not a good combo.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. We usually, what we do is we scout out people in the community that are active fairly often. They're coming in and they embody the character, as far as we can tell, that we would like to see nurtured and grown within our community, that we would like to see more in ourselves, right? So if I meet a person, they're decently, we like in our community, what we tend to prefer is really open to experience, right? Willing to have a good faith debate, but also willing to like call a spade and like be firm where they need to be firm. And is decently like intellectual, kind of nerdy, wants to like talk about ideas all the time, right? That tends to be what we look for. And then we approach those people and be like, hey, would you like to be a mod? Right. So now like our community leaders are an assortment of these people. And then as I'm approaching people, I'm keeping in mind like what biases are starting to get leaned toward. Like I'm very left leaning. So our first couple of mods were much more left leaning. So I was like, okay, we need a few conservative mods. To like balance out the worldview and stuff. And we were very intentional, like we want some women on the mod team, right? We would like some trans people on the team. We want to make sure that there's like some level of like racial diversity, not so much in like quota, but like keeping that in mind of being like, what's the spot that I'm going to be blind to and who can we pull in to kind of shed light on that? So that's like how Nick and I build our team. And then we also just spend a lot of time in our community. And we're very mindful to kick out certain people who really hold down the community culture. Yeah. Which is, everyone assumes that means toxic, but sometimes people are like really, really, really boring. And we also don't want that. Yeah. So we just try to be like mindful of like, and when I say boring, it's usually typically a person who like wants to engage, but they only want to talk about what they want to talk about. And they interrupt and kind of pull the conversation in only like one direction.
Gotcha.
We hate that. We'll be like pretty like, we'll usually just give verbal corrections. We don't really ban people very often. We'll just be like, hey, can you like stop just stealing the conversation and taking it wherever you want to go? Like, it's annoying. Stop it. We're very like direct in my community, but I'm not saying that that's like the golden standard for everyone. That's just what we do. And it works pretty well. I like my community, obviously, but I'm biased. So of course I do. It's my community.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. I think it works well for you, like the principles that you laid out, especially because it sounds like you're trying to not necessarily appeal to like left-leaning crowd exclusively, right? It sounds like you're trying to appeal to a more politically diverse crowd. How has that generally worked out from your experience? Because I mean, to cite Natalie's community as an example, like, that was basically like a really big point where it caused her community to kind of implode, where, she had, leftists kind of constantly infighting with each other to the point where it was just like, I just don't want to deal with it. Or she didn't want to deal with it, right? And I don't know, like, do you experience a lot of like toxic infighting, or like how are you able to deal with these kind of like very like moralized, let's say, sort of conversations in your community?
We've never had a mod that's going to be so like people like that are called religious, whether they believe in a god or not. I don't know. We don't have a single mod who's like religious as far as like my ideas are right and you're evil if you don't agree with me.
Sure.
That shit, get the fuck away. For the most part, right? There's some things that we'll obviously moralize about because there are some things that are immoral. But we also, I would say, have like a pretty strong nuance of like holding the belief that somebody can do a bad thing and be a good person, right? Like a really crazy take would be this person can be racist and have racist beliefs and broadly be a good person, right? That person would be welcome in our community and we'd constantly tell them that they're racist, right? And sure, and we would challenge them on it, right? So I'm not really sure because I think like different social spheres are going to run into different social problems. We don't really have the social implosion, mostly because anybody who's going to like be a moral frog and like try to like lambast others for their opinions when they, especially when that other person's like just trying to be reasonable, they just like have an opinion that we find detestable. To be honest, that person would never be modded and they'd never be tolerated in the community long term, right? And so like they do exist within our community. We just like call them out constantly. We have like somebody who's like a full on like Nazi. And we constantly tell him like, you're a Nazi. He gets muted all the time. He gets timed out constantly for being like a racist fuck. We constantly tell him that he's a racist fuck. We push him super hard. We fight with him about race realism all the time. He's still like welcome in the community at this point because he hasn't done like certain bannable stuff. So if you like harass people, if you try to dox people, if you do like actual like criminal like type behaviors, will ban you. Or if you're really annoying and you've pissed him off, you might also just catch a ban. Is there anything else that's like a strict TOS? Oh, if you can never engage in good faith ever. So like a lot of the race realist types get banned because they come in and they don't want to talk about ideas. They just want to insist that Black people are dumb. And it's like, I don't want to talk to you. It's not interesting to me. Like, fuck off, right? They'll get banned because they're being dumb, mean, and wrong all at the same time. So like we just have like rules of conduct that you can get banned over. You don't get to harass people, right? We don't use slurs. We're pretty strict on slur usage in the server. Mostly because it's like it's a pretty easy thing for people to like not enjoy, and it's a pretty easy thing to just like not include in your speech. So like it's like the bare minimum you can do is like not be a fucking dickhead.
Gotcha.
Anything else that's strict TOS bannable in the community?
No.
You're really annoying.
Oh, are we banning them for being annoying?
No, we've never banned anyone for being annoying. We don't really ban people often, to be honest. And when we do, it's usually for like harassing type behavior.
Gotcha.
So if you're harassing girls, we've had to ban like the first time ever we banned somebody because they were being like super weird with girls all the time, and no matter what the girls said of like stop, they wouldn't stop. So obviously they got banned for that. Not very shocking. People have been like banned for doing things that I think everyone would agree is really, really inappropriate behavior and not okay. And like if it's clear that you're just trying to tear down our community, you're gone.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So last area of kind of inquiry or question. So we talked about like developing a community and like what a content creator influencer can do to develop a community that can be mobilized. What are you going to be doing over the rest of the 2024 election cycle to try and mobilize your community in similar communities? Like what are the things that you're going to be doing that other creators that you recommend for other creators to do to try and have an impact in this year and also generally in IRL politics?
So I have 4 canvassing events upcoming this year that I'm helping organize with Progressive Victory. We've got a New York one for Jamal Bowman. We've got Wisconsin in September. And then the other 2 is we're still trying to decide which swing states, but there'll be a general election. Canvassing groups. I actually don't ask my community to go canvassing very often, which is kind of funny. I haven't really thought about why or why not. I just kind of like when I'm in the role, I focus so much on like all of the creators and their communities.
Gotcha.
I think I just like forget my community does a ton of IRL events though. Like we meet up probably like 3 times a year.
Oh wow.
Yes, we have like pretty major group events, which is probably part of what adds to the culture that we have in the community as well.
Gotcha.
But these IRL events can be super, super cool for streamers and content creators because I think it really like fosters that community. And in my mind, like if you're a content creator and you can help like 2 lonely people, which is the only reason they're on the internet and in your Discord, become friends and like build a lifelong friendship out of it. Like that's like a really beautiful thing, right? It's like your Discord is the reason that these 2 people have each other as best friends or partners for the rest of their life. Like that's really special.
Yeah.
And can you like facilitate a community towards that and then work for actionable goals? So the canvassing goals are great for Destiny's community because he's got a very politically mobilized audience, whereas like my community is less, actually they're more bipartisan, they're going to be a lot less like politically motivated, but I imagine if we did like let's all go to a homeless shelter or something like that, that's something my community would really get behind, whereas my community probably wouldn't care about canvassing because like half of them are conservative and wouldn't want to canvass for us anyway. So I think just like finding uses that you guys are interested in and come collect around and finding IRL ways to make it happen, I think really solidifies, because then your online friendship is like truly fully a real friendship. And those like little in-person touch points, I think really deepen those relationships.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Kyla, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please tell people where they can find you online?
Yeah, if I haven't utterly turned you off of my entire disposition, you can find me at Not So Erudite everywhere. YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, even Instagram. But my Instagram is basically non-political. It's just cosplay. So if you want like non-political stuff from me, you think I'm cute, feel free.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Bye.